Hello and welcome to this video on partial mashing grain for your beer or whiskey. This can be used in lieu of all grain brewing, which is slightly more advanced and difficult as you need to have a supply, or at least a larger supply, of grain to use. In the beginning of this process, the different kinds of malt are milled to break up the grain. This is an important step as increasing the surface area gives you a more efficient extraction of sugars. This product is known as grist. It's made from a combination of the husks and the crushed part of the grain, which is full of the saccharides. Partial mashing can be a good option if you're just beginning or not quite used to the process of all grain brewing. It's ideally suited for those recipes that are intended to be all grain, as you're not exactly having to make a huge change. The difference is that unlike the all grain mashing, you're substituting part of it for pre-made or pre-mashed, generally commercially made products. This means you have to handle less grain, don't require special equipment, and can often make do with relatively common items. This is a lot easier for the beginner and those who are intermediate. Mashing is made up of multiple steps, the important one being lautering. This is a substep of mashing that could be called the core step. This will influence everything downstream. Getting this wrong will muck up everything else you try to do afterwards. As we've mentioned, a partial mash is the easiest way to work your way towards an all-grain brew. It also gives you greater control over your fermentation. Either of these are perfectly good reasons to try it. Milling itself is relatively straightforward, it just takes time to get it right. Mashing isn't any more complex, but it does need to be done right. Order and process are essential to its success. Your mashing will take what is a otherwise unusable starch, often long chains of saccharides, and begins to use enzymes to break them down. This is one of the reasons why milling gets its own dedicated video, and why we're giving the dedicated video to mashing. Each step has to be done correct in its own way in order to ensure the next stage is going to do what you want done. As has been described in the past breakdown of malt, it relies on amylases, specifically the two known as beta and alpha amylase. The only problem with this really simple process is that both the enzymes separate at two different temperatures. This means that your beta amylases will be most active between 60 and 65 degrees centigrade, but not above 75. Your alpha amylases operate between 70 and 75 degrees centigrade, and they don't function above 80. There are three ways to try and balance these two different things. One is a happy medium between the two. Second is trying to choose one or the other temperature and hold it there. Finally, you could try moving between the two temperatures at different stages, but this is where things get hard. Trying to ensure that not only have you moved beyond the first amylase temperature, but you've also deactivated it and still kept the original one active without bringing your entire mash over the temperature for the second amylase is where things get difficult, as once you start deactivating them, it becomes very difficult to reactivate them and get things going once more. The whole process can be covered from here on, so if you're interested, consider watching from here out. All mashing begins with what is called a dough-in step. Dough-in is where you simply combine your water and dried malt. You do this at a low temperature, which does several things. First and foremost, it begins to turn your malt into a liquid state, or at least begins to extract it. It also provides the hydrolysis effect. Hydrolysis is where you begin breaking down some of those long starch chains. To do this, you begin with warm water. Think of it as being around 30 degrees or comfortable temperature. This is added directly to the grist, which is your ground down malt. You then knead this, and we've done it off camera. You then bring the temperature up to around 45 degrees centigrade. This is where you begin mashing. What we're activating here is one of those first enzymes. It's called beta-glucan. The reason you hold it here for a time is that you want to start by breaking down certain sugars and certain other things first. This ensures you get the maximum yield. Because we're doing this on a stove, we had to lower the temperature setting and hold it at about 40 degrees centigrade. This is because it continued to climb even after we turned down the heat. You'll need to use a similar method or anything you can find that achieves the same result for your ingredients at each stage of this mashing process. This is because there will always be residual heat transfer. This temperature begins the process reducing the large proteins to smaller ones, and can last between 10 and 45 minutes. We ran this for half an hour before moving on to the next stage. The mash was then raised to saccharification temperature. This can vary somewhat, and sits between 60 and 70 degrees. This is the first of the two temperatures you need to be aware of. We aimed for 65 degrees in order to have the beta amylases do their job. We held it at this temperature for roughly an hour. The proper term for this is known as resting rather than holding, but for the sake of convenience we'll simply say we held the temperature. After this we need to look at moving it above 70 degrees. Somewhere between 71 and 72 degrees is ideal, and we need to do this as quickly as possible in order to allow the alpha amylase to work. This should be held for somewhere around half an hour. These two temperatures are very important. It is the range in which most of your large, long starch carbohydrates will be enzymatically broken down into something usable by your yeast. You will be producing maltose, maltotriose, sucrose, glucose, and fructose. You will also be making dextrin. This last sugar is not fermentable. Overall, you should look at holding it somewhere between an hour and an hour and a half for these first two. Alternatively, you could consider holding it at 70 degrees Celsius for between an hour and an hour and a half. This fits into the temperature range of both enzymes and would be viable. What you gain in the expedience of process, you lose in selectivity. This means that depending on what you're trying to brew and from what, it may not be a viable option. After you've gotten to the point where you've completed your saccharification, you need to bring your mash temperature up to above 75 degrees. This is known as the mashoff. The mashoff is an important step. Above 75 degrees, most of the enzymes you've been using, if not all of them, should be terminated. That is, they become denatured and cease functioning. You want to hold it at this 75 or higher degrees for about 30 minutes. The process we've described so far is not much different from baking bread, with the process of creating dough, resting, and then heating. Now that you know the right temperatures and approximate times, there's another variable to add: the water used. In another throwback to an old video, it's time we look at water composition. This is important with pH and other variables influencing, if not outright preventing, enzyme activities. Certain metals, minerals, and other things in your water can drastically alter the ability of the enzymes to act in the way they need to. Consider if your water is coming from a mineral spring. There's a good chance you'll have something like magnesium in it. This will have a direct effect on many of the enzymes and prevent their activity. In general, your average brewer wants a small amount of calcium in their water. This could be decreased or increased for certain beer styles, but in general, you want to have a small amount in there which will help with some of the flavours. You may also want to consider modifying the pH of the mash after you've finished making it. You want to bring the pH down to somewhere between 5.3 and 5.7. This can be done with something like lactic acid. This is useful for later on when you go into fermentation. Addition of other flavouring agents like hops won't drastically alter this, but that fermentation temperature is considered ideal for a wort. Once you've done this and you've extracted all of your sugars, you can take a look at just what you've used. Quite often you'll be able to find information on exactly what's in many good malt varieties, and you can begin to figure out how you need to change the temperature and for how long. If you find that your beer lacks body, you should consider extending the alpha amylase period. If you find that you aren't getting enough sweetness, you should consider extending the beta amylase period. There are other ways to modify this, but those two are the important ones to initially consider. Long term, you may want to explore other options based on the results you find with how your mash has gone. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions or suggestions you might have below.